From 20 feet away, it looked less like a shelter than a mistake someone had pushed into concrete. There was an old freight underpass on the edge of town, the kind of low, soot-dark tunnel that carried road salt, echo, and headlight glare all winter long. Halfway down the right wall, just past the bend where the wind changed direction, a maintenance recess had been packed with scraps of rigid foam in every color a construction site throws away. Blue board, pink board, yellowed chunks with foil still stuck to one face. White appliance foam with broken corners. Strips of carpet pad. A sheet of thin plywood bowed inward like a rib. Nothing matched. Nothing looked finished. It had the rough, embarrassed look of something built out of what people didn't even bother stealing. Before you judge what this is, tell me, what do you think someone is building here? The recess had been made smaller on purpose. Whoever built it had not tried to clear space inside that nook. He had done the opposite. He had stuffed the cavity until only a narrow sleeping chamber remained, barely wider than a human torso, with an offset opening no taller than a mailbox slot when viewed straight on. If you stood there long enough, you noticed details that did not belong to panic or random scavenging. The pieces were cross-laid, so the seams never lined up. The floor sat above the concrete on short blocks. The entrance didn't run straight to the back wall. It bent slightly, forcing the air to turn before it reached the sleeping space. Near the roof of the pod, almost too small to notice, there was a vent the size of a jar lid. It looked ugly enough for people to laugh at it. It looked deliberate enough to make them stop laughing a second later. At dusk, breath from the underpass drifted in thin gray ribbons. Truck noise rolled overhead. Meltwater clicked in the drain channel below. And in that patchwork of scavenged insulation, someone had built a dry, tight hollow inside one of the coldest materials in the city. The question was not only who had done it. The real question was why it worked at all. By the time people understood that Nook, the winter had already made its judgment. The county airport would log the lowest temperature of the season before dawn. Pipes would burst in older houses. Car batteries would surrender in supermarket parking lots. Even inside apartments with working heat, windows would bloom white at the corners. And down in that underpass, inside a recess most people would never have considered inhabitable, a 17-year-old who had been told to leave home with a trash bag of clothes would stay alive because he understood something almost nobody around him bothered to notice. His name was Eli Mercer. When people later told the story, they made his exile sound sudden, as if a single argument had thrown him into the cold. It was not that clean. It had been building for months. His mother had died the previous spring. The apartment had been shrinking ever since. Not physically, but in the other way rooms shrink, when every object starts to feel temporary and every conversation sounds like a warning. His stepfather's patience thinned, then hardened. Eli was old enough to be called a problem and too young to be treated like a man. By December, he was sleeping lightly, keeping his shoes on, storing his school notebooks in a grocery bag under the bed in case he had to move fast. At 17, people still use the word kid, but the world is already willing to punish you like an adult. The night he was told to get out, the temperature was falling through the 20s. He left with 2 hoodies, one coat that used to belong to his uncle, a duffel bag, a sleeping bag with a broken zipper, and $43 in cash. He spent the first 3 nights moving between places that felt survivable at sunset and became dangerous by 2 in the morning. A laundromat vestibule until the owner locked the inner door. The back seat of a friend's car until the friend's older brother found out. A screened porch with old cushions that held damp like memory. He learned fast that cold is not just low temperature. Cold is concrete under your hips. Cold is wind finding the wet stripe of sweat under your shirt. Cold is the way a blanket that feels heavy at midnight feels worthless before dawn. The underpass was not the first place he noticed. It was the first place he understood. Most people passing through saw filth, graffiti, runoff, and danger. Eli saw geometry. The tunnel ran east to west, which mattered because the prevailing winter wind hit the western mouth harder, then ricocheted down the curve rather than traveling cleanly through. The recess itself sat on the leeward side of the bend. It had a raised lip 3 inches above the main slab, and the drainage channel ran lower than that, closer to the center line of the tunnel. After a sleet storm, he checked it again and found the back half still dry. He came once at dawn and once after midnight, testing not comfort but behavior, where the air moved, where frost formed first, how long the concrete held runoff before drying, whether anyone used the Nook for anything. Nobody did. It had likely been built decades earlier for a maintenance cabinet or electrical service box, then forgotten when the wiring was updated. To everyone else, it was a dead cut in a wall. To him, it was a pre-made shell with 3 sides already buried inside thermal mass and one face he could control. That is not the sort of thought people expect from a boy hauling his life in a duffel bag. And that was part of the reason so many of them misread what he was doing. He did not come to winter knowledge through camping fantasies or internet survival clips. He came to it the way many quiet, observant poor kids do, by paying close attention because waste had consequences. He had spent 2 years in auto shop at school and another year helping an older neighbor strip usable material from demolition jobs. He knew what made a car warm up quickly after a cold start and why the same car lost heat fast if a door seal failed. He knew the floor pan under a truck could drain your warmth even when the cabin air seemed tolerable. He had watched pipe fitters wrap steam lines in layers and leave expansion gaps where amateurs would have sealed everything tight. He knew the difference between something that blocks wind and something that actually slows heat loss. He had no technical credential, no workshop, no clean pile of materials. What he had was a habit of noticing where energy went. He began collecting foam scraps 3 days after he found the Nook. Not all insulation is equal, and he knew just enough to sort the useful from the useless. Closed cell pieces mattered most, because they kept their structure when damp air condensed nearby. Thick pink and blue boards from commercial jobs were best for the wall against the concrete. Foil-faced polyiso was valuable near the inner layer if he could keep a slight air gap on one side. Expanded white foam was brittle and annoying, but even bad foam was better than blankets pressed directly against frozen masonry. The carpet pad would not insulate like a rigid board, yet it softened the pressure points and helped stop warm, moist breath from striking a hard, cold surface inches from his face. He scavenged offcuts from a residential build site, from a roofing dumpster, from a broken appliance behind a repair shop. If a piece was too ugly for anyone else to save, it became more likely to survive until he could carry it away. That was when the comments started. A guy from the tire shop across the road asked if he was building a doghouse for himself. 2 men smoking under the eave of a cinderblock garage watched him carry a stack of mismatched panels toward the tunnel and asked whether he planned to freeze inside his little cooler. One of them laughed at the size of the opening and said a coffin had more elbow room. Another said foam sweats and would turn to ice by morning. A woman walking her dog took one look at the recess and said, not unkindly, that if he meant to survive winter he needed more space, not less. That was the common assumption. More room meant more comfort. Bigger meant safer. Anything that looked cramped looked wrong. Eli never argued for long, because explaining heat loss to people who do not respect your circumstances can feel like trying to explain mathematics to a locked door. Still, he was not building by instinct alone. He was reducing the air volume his body would have to warm. He was breaking contact with the concrete. He was stopping convective wash from the tunnel. He was managing moisture before moisture managed him. The ugliness was partly the point. He was not trying to impress anyone. He was trying to make a piece of city infrastructure behave less like a cold sink and more like a shell. The first layer went in deepest, thicker rigid foam pressed against the back and side concrete, trimmed with a handsaw and utility knife, not to create a perfect seal, but to stop the wall from feeling like a refrigerator plate. Where gaps remained, he filled them with smaller offcuts turned sideways, because even irregular dead air cells were better than direct contact. Over that came a cross layer of thinner pieces so seams overlapped. He used construction tape when he had it, duct tape when he didn't, and in the places where neither would stick to dusty concrete, he wedged pressure-fit strips between larger panels like shims in a machine housing. Then he did something people truly did not understand. He built the floor first as if warmth rose from below, even though it didn't. He scavenged 2 broken shipping pallets, pried away the worst boards, cut them down, and set them over short masonry chunks to create a shallow platform above the slab. Not high enough to make the shelter roomy, just high enough to stop his body weight from crushing the insulation beneath him and to create an air break between him and the concrete. Above the slats, he laid a sandwich, rigid foam, then cardboard as a sacrificial layer, then carpet pad, then an old wool blanket he found in a donation bin. He knew the coldest part of a bad shelter is usually not the air around you, but the surface under you. A sleeping bag with an excellent loft means almost nothing where your body has flattened it to paper. He narrowed the sleeping chamber to a width just under 30 inches. That sounded absurd to the men who mocked him. It was exactly why the Nook had a chance. A human body does not heat space efficiently if that space is large, leaky, and lined with stone. But a body inside a reduced volume, protected from drafts and isolated from conductive surfaces, can create a survivable microclimate without flame or electricity. Eli had no safe way to run a heater there, and he was smart enough not to trust open fire in a tunnel half full of scavenged material. So he did what overlooked mechanics and winter laborers have done forever when fuel is scarce. He shrank the air and hardened the shell. The entrance became the cleverest part. If he had simply covered the front with a blanket, wind pressure from the tunnel would have found its way through every shift and flutter. Instead, he built a shallow dogleg. A piece of plywood formed the first face, stopping short of the floor by a few inches. Behind that, inside and offset to one side, he hung a doubled moving blanket and backed it with another foam panel. Cold air, entering low, had to dip and turn before it could reach the main sleeping space. Warmed air stayed higher near the back wall. The tiny vent near the roof prevented the chamber from becoming a wet lung of trapped breath. There was also a controlled leak low at the entrance, because a completely sealed pod sounds efficient only to people who have never woken in one drenched with condensation and starved of fresh air. He was building less like a camper and more like someone winterizing a machine. That is why the Nook looked strange. From outside, it seemed overstuffed, irrational, claustrophobic. From inside, the logic began to reveal itself. The floor was warmer than bare concrete by a margin he could feel through his knees. The wall at his back no longer pulled heat the way uninsulated masonry does. The entrance did not whistle. The air near the top of the chamber became noticeably milder after 20 minutes. Breath still condensed, of course. Winter does not surrender because a smart boy found a few sheets of foam. But the moisture formed where he expected it to form, near the cooler outer baffle, not deep against his sleeping bag. That mattered. Wet insulation kills slowly, and then all at once. He started taking notes because intuition is easy to dismiss and numbers are harder to laugh away. On the fourth night after he began using the Nook, he bought a cheap indoor-outdoor thermometer from a discount hardware aisle with money he should probably have spent on food. He ran the probe wire through a crack in the entrance. On a 23-degree night, with light wind and no heater, the tunnel air sat at 19 by midnight. At head level in the back of the pod, after an hour inside, the temperature held at 34. Near the floor by his boots it was colder, 26. Inside his sleeping bag, with dry base layers and a knit cap, it was not comfortable in the domestic sense, but it was controlled. More importantly, it was stable. That notebook became his argument. He wrote down outside temperature, tunnel temperature, pod temperature near the head, pod temperature near the floor, and what had gone wrong. Where his left shoulder touched the wall, he added a strip of foam. When he woke with dampness on the inner baffle, he widened the upper vent by less than an inch. When the cardboard underlayer began to soften, he replaced it and added a thin sheet of plastic beneath the carpet pad so ground moisture would not creep upward. Every change was small. Every change came from observation, not pride. What looked like scavenging from the road was actually iterative engineering. A church volunteer who brought soup twice a week told him he was making things unnecessarily complicated and should try a congregate shelter instead. Eli had tried. The shelter was often full, sometimes violent, and almost never restful. He did not say this with bitterness. He said it with the tired precision of someone who had already tested the options. A cot indoors sounds morally superior until you factor in theft, noise, bedbugs, drunken shouting, and the fact that some nights there was simply no cot. The foam Nook did not solve his life. It solved a narrower question, which in winter can be the most urgent question of all. Can the body make it to morning without losing too much heat, too much sleep, too much strength? People around him kept misunderstanding the appearance of poverty as the absence of thought. There is always a temptation, from a safe distance, to turn hardship into character mythology. But cold does not refine people. More often, it reduces them. It shortens patience, clouds judgment, punishes small mistakes, and makes every ordinary task cost more than it should. What made Eli unusual was not that suffering had made him noble. It was that even inside instability, He kept enough clarity to notice how the environment behaved and enough discipline to act on what he noticed. That confusion runs deep. When a rich man builds a tiny, efficient pod, the world calls it ingenious. When a homeless boy does it from trash, the same logic can look deranged until it proves itself under pressure. Eli knew that without having the language for it. He felt it in the way people glanced at his hands before they listened to his words, in the way they equated rough material with rough thinking. So he kept refining the Nook with the stubborn privacy of someone who had learned not to perform his competence for approval. By the second week, the patchwork recess had a system. The outermost layer against the concrete was thick and forgiving, there to stop the wall from pulling heat directly. The middle layer existed mostly to break seams and trap irregular pockets of air. The inner face near his torso and shoulders used the cleaner pieces, including 2 foil-faced panels he set with the reflective side turned inward where a small air space remained. He knew reflective surfaces do almost nothing when pressed tight against fabric, but can help when positioned properly. He left them where the geometry allowed a gap, not where the internet would have told him to put them for show. Along the roof of the chamber, he added softer material, not for warmth alone, but because hard, cold surfaces inches above a sleeping face turn breath into dripping misery. He even angled one ceiling piece slightly, so moisture would run toward the entrance side rather than down onto his chest. There was intelligence in every ugly line. One evening, the man from the tire shop watched him slide another strip of insulation into the entrance baffle and asked, with a smirk that had lost some confidence, why he was making the opening so crooked. Eli told him straight, because straight entrances leak, because wind likes a clean shot, because cold air behaves like water when you give it a path. The man shrugged as if unconvinced, but he stopped joking about the doghouse after that. The first real proof came with freezing rain. Warm storms in deep winter can be worse than dry cold because they soak fabric, glaze surfaces, and then lock everything solid when the temperature drops again. The underpass hissed that night. Tire spray blew through in bursts. Water ran along the main slab and found the drain channel exactly where Eli hoped it would, not across his platform. The outer baffle darkened with moisture. The inside chamber stayed dry except for a rim of frost near the vent. In the morning, a spare pair of socks he had hung near the inner wall were merely cool, not wet. A plastic bottle left in the main tunnel froze into a hard cylinder. The bottle tucked inside the foot of his sleeping space came out slushy but pourable. Not miraculous, not cozy. Still, the difference between a frozen bottle and a slushy one can be the difference between numb panic and a workable morning. He wrote the numbers down. Tunnel, 17 degrees Fahrenheit at 2:10 a.m. Pod at pillow height, 31 degrees Fahrenheit. Foot area, 24 degrees Fahrenheit. Water outside, solid. Water inside, partial freeze. Those notes mattered because the Nook was never meant to feel like a room. The goal was not to create comfort that would impress a suburban viewer. The goal was to keep the body from cascading into failure. In a serious cold, survival can be a game of margins. Enough rest to think clearly tomorrow. Enough warmth to keep fingers usable. Enough dryness to stop the next night from becoming impossible because the last one soaked your insulation. Eli was not winning winter. He was reducing damage. That distinction is what made the coming storm so important. Forecasts started talking 3 days in advance. Arctic air. Highs below zero. Wind chills in the -20s. The kind of language local news uses when it wants people to picture exposed skin in terms of minutes. Hardware stores sold out of faucet covers. Grocery aisles lost bread and batteries. School administrators began drafting delay notices before snow had even arrived. Eli listened to the forecast from a radio behind the counter of a gas station, where he sometimes warmed up with a coffee he stretched half the night. He already knew what the town was about to learn. A cold that is severe turns every weak point into a verdict. The men at the garage saw him carrying yet more foam and told him he was wasting effort. One said nothing that ugly was going to beat a real freeze. Another predicted the whole arrangement would turn into an icebox and trap him in colder air than the tunnel itself. This sounded plausible if you did not understand the difference between enclosed cold and controlled loss. Eli did not need the pod to be warm in absolute terms. He needed it to be warmer where his body was, drier where his insulation mattered, calmer where wind otherwise would strip heat with every draft. He needed the cold to slow down. That afternoon, he made his final changes. He replaced one cracked floor panel with a thicker piece salvaged from a commercial dumpster. He added a detachable wedge near the footbox to reduce dead space around his legs. He reinforced the outer baffle with a strip of rubber from an old floor mat, so it would not flap when gusts curled through the tunnel. He brushed every surface free of loose frost and checked the drain line twice. He packed dry clothes in a contractor bag, filled a small bottle at the gas station sink, and ate as much as he could afford before dark because calories are not merely fuel in winter, they are timing. A warm body with no reserves becomes a cooling problem quickly. If you have ever wondered how much useful knowledge the world walks past because it arrives in ugly form, this is the part worth remembering. No panel in that shelter was expensive. None of it looked sophisticated. A city crew might have removed the whole thing as refuse if they had seen it too early. Yet piece by piece, a boy most people had already placed in the category of failure had built a thermal strategy out of leftovers, and he was about to test it against the harshest night of the season. The cold came in layers. At sundown, it was merely sharp. By 8 o'clock, the metal handrail at the west entrance looked dry and burned bare skin on contact. By 10, the underpass had emptied of casual foot traffic. The sound changed. Engines on the road above seemed more distant, as if the air itself had tightened. Eli crawled into the Nook wearing dry socks, thermal bottoms under his jeans, 2 hoodies, a wool cap, and gloves thin enough to let him still write. He closed the first panel. The moving blanket settled behind him. The little chamber shrank to the dimensions he had engineered for exactly this night. 78 inches long, just under 30 wide, roughly 32 high at the shoulder and lower toward the feet. It was not a place you conquered claustrophobia in. It was a place you entered because mathematics favored it. The thermometer probe hung outside the baffle. The display unit sat near his pillow, its weak little LCD numbers looking almost absurdly domestic in that patched cocoon. He waited for the microclimate to form. At first, the chamber felt brutally honest. Nothing romantic about it. Foam smelled faintly chemical. Cold radiated through any spot where his body compressed the wrong surface. Each breath sounded larger than the space allowed. But after 15 minutes, the draft on his forehead disappeared. After 30, the biting sensation around his ears eased. After 40, he could feel the difference between the zone above his chest and the colder air pooled low near the entrance gap. By 11:30, the tunnel air was 4 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside, at head height, the pod read 28 degrees Fahrenheit. That number would disappoint anyone expecting miracles. Eli knew better. 24 degrees of separation from the surrounding air, created with no heater, no power, and almost no money, is not failure in a concrete tunnel. It is life buying time. He tucked the bottle near his hips, sealed the contractor bag of spare clothes, and listened to the first hard gusts rake the underpass. The outer panel thudded once, then held. Snow blew through the western mouth in ghostly sheets and died at the bend. Meltwater from older slush refroze into a skin outside the platform, exactly where he did not want to step in the morning, but exactly where he could tolerate it overnight. Just after midnight, the first problem arrived. Moisture from his breath began frosting the inner edge of the ceiling more heavily than before. The storm outside had driven the pressure pattern in the tunnel lower and faster, which altered the way fresh air was feeding through the entrance gap. This is the part people miss when they imagine improvised shelters as fixed achievements. They are living systems. Conditions change. A shelter that works on a quiet 13-degree night can fail in a wind-driven -5 because the airflow is no longer the same. Eli did what competent people do under pressure. He did not dramatize. He tested. He cracked the inner blanket half an inch near the lower side and waited. The frost rate slowed. The head level temperature dipped 2 degrees, then stabilized again. That tiny change told him the chamber had been holding humidity too well for the new pressure conditions. He wrote the time in the notebook by flashlight, hands stiff but controlled. Later, people would remember the shelter as though it were one good idea. It was not. It was a chain of corrected assumptions. Around 1:30 in the morning, the county airport would record -9. In the tunnel, with the wind funneling at intervals from the west entrance, it likely felt worse. The cheap thermometer outside the pod dropped to -7, then -8. Eli lay still, not because he was fearless, but because unnecessary movement burns energy and pumps dampness into clothing. He kept his hood away from his mouth so he would not soak it with breath. He did not let his bare skin touch the wall. He rotated one foot slightly when he felt pressure thinning the insulation beneath his heel. These were small acts, almost invisible. In winter, small acts add up faster than speeches. At 2:06, head level pod temperature, 27 degrees Fahrenheit. At 2:53, 29 degrees Fahrenheit. At 3:41, when the outside reading dropped again, the pod held 28 degrees Fahrenheit. That steadiness was the proof. Not luxury. Not warm enough to lounge in. Stability. And inside the sleeping bag, with dry layers and a reduced air volume around his body, the effective warmth was enough for his core to hold and his hands to remain responsive. The bottle by his thigh stayed liquid. A metal spoon left near the entrance rim frosted white. A second spoon deeper inside barely filmed over. The outside face of the baffle glittered with rime. The inside face remained mostly dry except at the vent edge. Every line of frost had become a map of the system. The cold was showing him where it traveled, and the structure was forcing it to travel the long way around. By 4 a.m, the town was at its most fragile. This is the hour when furnaces run hardest, when bad seals and old windows announce themselves, when people in real beds burrow deeper without knowing how near the edges are for someone outside. Under the road, Eli half slept and half listened. He knew the danger of deep, careless sleep in harsh cold when exhaustion starts masquerading as comfort. So he checked himself at intervals. Wiggle toes. Flex fingers. Touch the inside wall. Note the dampness. Sip water. Protect the dry layers. The shelter had narrowed his problem to something manageable, but it had not removed responsibility. That, too, was part of its design. It worked with vigilance, not in place of it. A little after 5, the underpass entered that strange silence winter sometimes creates when even traffic seems late to the morning. Eli unzipped the bag enough to check the thermometer display. Outside the baffle, minus 11 degrees Fahrenheit. Pod at pillow height, 30 degrees Fahrenheit. 30 degrees may not sound like salvation until you remember what the alternative was. Minus 11 in a tunnel with moving air strips, heat with terrifying efficiency. 30 in a protected microclimate is not home, but it is survivable when your insulation is dry, your floor is broken from the slab, your air leaks are controlled, and your body is not fighting a large cold volume. The difference between those two numbers was more than comfort. It was judgment. It was the answer to every laugh about his cooler, every shrug from men who thought bigger must be better, every pitying glance from people who mistook the look of the shelter for the quality of the thinking inside it. When dawn finally started bleaching the west entrance gray, Eli opened the outer panel. A rind of frost framed the dogleg opening. Snow had feathered into the tunnel and stopped just short of the baffle. The slab outside glittered with black ice. The water bottle he had left in the main passage the evening before was now a solid white club. His spare bottle, the one inside with him, still moved when shaken. He crawled out slowly, joints stiff, not triumphant so much as intact. And sometimes intact is the most honest form of victory. The tire shop man saw him later that morning, standing at the gas station counter with both hands around a paper cup, and stared a second too long before asking if he had actually stayed in that thing all night. Eli said yes. The man asked what the inside temperature was. When Eli told him, the first response was not admiration. It was confusing. Then came the silence people make when a rough fact forces them to revise an easy judgment. He went back to the tunnel in daylight with the man and one of the mechanics. In daylight, the Nook looked even less impressive. No cinematic mystery, no protective darkness. Just patched foam, dirty tape, a bent plywood face, and a sleeping chamber so narrow the mechanic laughed once on instinct before crouching down to look. Then he noticed the raised floor, the overlapping seams, the vent, the offset entry. He put his hand against the inner wall and frowned as though insulted by its relative warmth compared with the concrete beside it. Eli showed them the notebook. Dates, times, readings, small corrections. The mechanic asked who had taught him to do that. Eli shrugged in the embarrassed way people do when the truthful answer sounds too plain. Nobody, exactly. Pieces of school. Pieces of jobs. Watching. Paying attention. That was the full shape of the mystery. The shelter had not worked because foam is magical. It had worked because intelligence had been applied to limits. Any fool can imagine survival in terms of heroic endurance. Eli approached it as a heat transfer problem. He treated space like something to be reduced, surfaces like something to be interrupted, moisture like a threat that had to be managed before it became visible. He did not need ideal materials. He needed enough material arranged in the right order, with the right gaps, for the right reasons. People saw scraps. He saw function. There is a reason stories like this endure longer than a weather report. Cold exposes bad assumptions. It punishes vanity, punishes guesswork, punishes structures built for how they look instead of how they behave. That little nook in the tunnel had no beauty conventional enough to earn respect in advance. Respect arrived only after the numbers did, after the county logged its bitterest dawn of the winter, and the boy in the foam-lined recess stepped out alive, dry enough, clear-eyed enough, and able to explain exactly why. A few days later, the mechanic from the garage brought him 2 better offcuts from a remodel job and an old sleeping pad that still had life in it. He did not make a speech. He did not apologize for laughing. He just handed the materials over and asked whether another inch under the hips would help more than another inch on the wall. Eli answered immediately, under the hips first. The man nodded once, the way men sometimes do when they recognize competence and would rather acknowledge it through work than sentiment. That mattered more than praise. Before long, the underpass nook began looking slightly less accidental. Cleaner inner layer. Better pad. A plastic tote for dry gear. Somebody from the church still tried to get Eli inside whenever a safer bed was available, and eventually, with a little luck and a little human decency arriving late, but not too late, he would spend fewer nights in that shelter. But the coldest night had already done what titles and stories always promise, and real winters rarely grant so neatly. It had proved the point in terms no one could comfortably deny. Not that the point was poverty builds character. It doesn't. Cold is not noble. Being thrown out at 17 is not a lesson plan. The point was narrower and more useful. Under pressure, clear thinking can look shabby. Practical intelligence often arrives without polish, without permission, and without the kind of packaging people are trained to respect. Eli's shelter was made of leftovers because leftovers were what he had. The part that saved him was not the foam itself. It was the arrangement, the restraint, the refusal to solve the wrong problem. He did not try to heat a tunnel. He heated the smallest surviving pocket inside it. He did not trust thickness alone. He broke contact, slowed drafts, controlled moisture, reduced volume, and let his own body do the rest. And when the coldest night of the year, pressed against the city hard enough to split pipes and humble furnaces, that ugly little chamber in the concrete wall held its margin. Not by much, not beautifully, but enough. Sometimes enough is the whole engineering miracle. If there is anything worth carrying from this story, it may be that overlooked knowledge rarely announces itself in elegant form. Sometimes it looks like a boy hauling broken foam through dirty snow. Sometimes it looks like a shelter people mistake for trash until the weather tests it. Sometimes the smartest thing in sight is the thing nobody would have photographed before the frost line proved where the heat had stayed. By the end of winter, plenty of people could describe the nook. The colors, the size, the weird little bent entrance. What fewer of them could describe was the deeper shape of the mind that built it, the patience to observe before acting, the humility to revise after each night, the discipline to care about inches, leaks, surfaces, and dampness when everyone else was speaking in broad emotional guesses. But that was the real structure inside the concrete recess. The foam was only the visible part. In the years after, whenever somebody told the story too simply, said the kid survived because he found good insulation, or because he got lucky with a tunnel, or because he was just tough enough, anyone who had looked closely knew that wasn't quite true. Plenty of people find material. Plenty of people endure for a while. What Eli had, on the hardest night, was something quieter and rarer. He understood the problem well enough to make cheap things behave above their station. And in winter, understanding is often warmer than pride. So when people remember that underpass now, they do not remember a miracle hidden in the wall. They remember a patchwork chamber crammed into a forgotten nook, a shelter so rough it invited ridicule. And the morning a 17-year-old crawled out of it after the year's deepest freeze with a notebook in his pocket and the proof still glowing weakly on a discount thermometer. The foam scraps were only what he could carry. Intelligence was what carried him. If stories like this make you see things differently, subscribe to Frontier Trapper for more untold survival stories. And if you enjoyed it, Leave a like so this reaches others who need it.